Welcome to a theological dust-up hosted by FreeThinking Ministries. I'm Dr. Tim Stratton, and with me today is the author of a new book that argues for the existence of the human soul. Not only that, but our guest today argues for a specific view of the soul. I love this topic, and I can't wait to dig into this conversation with our guest. So without further ado, please welcome Joshua Ryan Farris. And come on, I think you're trying.
There we are. Good to be with you. Thank you for having me. Good to chat with you.
Yeah, it is a blessing and an honor to have you here today, Joshua. We've had the privilege of having a few phone calls with each other and several emails back and forth. But it's good to finally get you on video here and to see your face. And man, I just found out right before you came on the show that you are planning to be at the EPS in San Antonio next month, and we'll get to hang out there in person. So I'm really looking forward to that as well.
That'll be great. Yeah. I look forward to it. Yeah.
You and I are going to have some fun. So
that's right.
But I think today's going to be fun.
Yes.
So, man, I guess before we get going, tell us a little bit about yourself and, you know, what you care about, your research interests, and what have you worked on that feeds into your awesome new book, The Creation of Self?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, presently I am a Humboldt Experience Researcher Fellow in Germany and visiting professor at the Ruhr Universität Bochum, University of Bochum, basically. Yeah. So I'm there right now, and I'm also helping start up a new school online, Missional University. And I have a daughter. We live here in Birmingham, Alabama. And so that's a little bit about me. I kind of got into this area of interest, broadly, theological anthropology, the study of the human being and what it means to be a human being in the context of theology, particularly how it is that we relate to God. So at one level, these have been with me they're questions that we all have in some sense. They're all big picture questions that we have. What does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean? What is the meaning of life? These all intersect with how we understand the person or the human and what it is to be a human. And so these are important questions, and theology, or a theological lens, certainly has an important place in that discussion and how it is that we work out the various issues related therein. And so I guess I've been working broadly on theological anthropology for really since my doctoral work, and published my doctoral work as The Soul of Theological Anthropology, which was an exploration of Cartesianism in specific theological categories, and then an introduction to theological anthropology more broadly with Baker, and then this latest book, which is a more even more philosophical approach, or natural theological approach, looking at the person as a soul. I really became interested in this in my seminary days when I took systematic theology 2. And that's where we really started raising the questions about what it means to be a human being, theological anthropology, what it means to be a human being as a gender being, gender roles. How do genders relate to one another? Those sorts of big picture questions. What's the constitution of the human? What is the image of God in particular? That's a big question in theological anthropology. And so simultaneously, I was also really interested in the sort of broader philosophical issues and how the philosophical literature impinges upon or informs our theological understanding of the human being, how it shapes and influences, and how it helps us to make sense of or clarify certain theological issues of the human being. And so that's when I guess it was really in that class that I really started thinking about the human a bit more seriously, a bit more systematically, and carefully. And that's what I wanted to do my doctoral research on. I saw the influence of philosophy and the nature of human constitution, what it is that we're made of, how it is that we are composed, what are we? Ultimately, are we souls? Are we bodies? Are we souls plus bodies? Are we
Yeah.
brains? Are we
Right.
something else altogether? A third kind of thing? And so these questions became of interest to me, but they certainly have a place in philosophy, but they also have a place in theology, and in
Hmm.
different ways, asking a different set of questions that are interrelated. And so that's what I worked on in my doctoral dissertation, where I kind of explored three different views of the human being, and how they interact with certain theological issues in what's traditionally known as theological anthropology. So
Yeah.
my work was broadly what you would think of as kind of a analytic theology of
Hmm.
being, analytic
Yeah.
theological anthropology. And so ever since then, I've had interests um, in both philosophy as well as in theology, in even in sort of different readings of scripture, and how it is that we get at these bigger questions of the human being. And so sometimes in my work, I've done a bit more philosophical work and engaging with the philosophers. And then other times I'm really more interested in the theological work. But I think
Yeah.
at the end of the day, all of the work that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the human has something more to say about the human in relation to God. And so the bigger picture, or even when I'm asking the philosophical questions, really I'm trying to tap into or scratch the itch of some bigger theological question
Mm.
about what it means to be a human, what it means
Yeah.
to be in the image of God. And so that is sort of a little bit of background, kind of backdrop of what kind of feeds into this most recent book, The Creation of Self. And in The Creation of Self, I make kind of a general case for the soul, as well as a more particular case for a
Yeah.
particular brand of the soul,
Hmm.
in a conversation with other views of the human being that might be certainly not theistic, or not theistic inclined, or at least they give no robust place for theism or God as an explanation of souls. And so the bigger argument of the book was kind of really kind of hit me in, I think it was in 2011 or 2012. At the beginning of my dissertation, I had this intuition about what it means to be a person.
Yeah.
And this intuition that what it means to be a person really does point us back to God. And it does propel us to or prompt us to ask these questions about how God is related to us via the soul. And so I had this
Hmm.
intuitive argument that was kind of rough, very rough in my mind in 2011, 2012. And that kind of stayed with me for so many years. It's kind of implicit or in the background, maybe, of the other two books, although those are much more explicitly theological in nature. It stayed with, but it's the intuition is there, it's present. But in this book, I try to spell it out and give the sort of, you might say, the ghost feet
Mm.
and hands and feet, so that
Yeah.
um, so we can kind of make sense of or grapple with this underlying intuition about the nature of the soul that really ultimately points to God Himself.
Hmm.
Um, so anyway, that's a little bit of background and what feeds into the creation of self, and why I'm interested in this subject. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm definitely interested in this subject as well. Think that you've really uncovered some important things on this. So let's get into that. Give us some of the big picture items that you're covering in this awesome book.
Yeah. So again, so this is more of a philosophical approach, or you might call it a kind of piece of natural theology. Um, in natural theology, through the lens of what philosophers or analytics call philosophy of mind, the kind of big picture questions about what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about the mind, what we're talking about when we talk about consciousness, mental events, mental happenings, but also how it relates to the brain or the body. And so the big picture questions about the person and composition, or the constitution question. So there is certainly aspects of this that are touching upon, quite explicitly touching upon the nature of personal identity. What is it that makes you you? What is it that makes me me? And what is it that makes a person a person? Or more specifically, what is it that makes a person that person? Or what is it that makes my person this person and not
Right.
your person? And so
Right.
these more fundamental philosophical questions about personal identity. So that's kind of, you might say, the big sort of picture of the book. And of course, in that, I touch upon other issues related to how philosophy of mind impinges upon epistemology, in terms of how we understand knowledge, in terms of how we understand the relationship between mental events and physical events, and how these impinge upon ways in which we know about the world. This becomes an important lens by which I develop the more specific argument in the book, where I kind of lay out an argument for the soul, and even a more particular brand of the soul. And then even further, how this is related to God, or how this intimately overlaps with God himself, and points us to God as the explanation, and even the causal explanation of the soul's coming into existence. So there's an important discussion about the nature of personal identity, and then personal identity as it overlaps with this older discussion about kind of the origins of souls, or the origins of personhood. Something that dominated in many ways a lot of the discussions in much of philosophical and theological history regarding the human being. Where is it that the soul comes from? And how do we get the soul? It's somewhat mysterious. There's something so unique about the nature of personhood that demands some kind of unique explanation. And that sort of, at least theological intuition, drove me to sort of press into some of the analytic literature and develop an argument that points me in this direction, to say that there's something radically unique about the person as a soul that demands a kind of explanation that's distinct from the bodily explanation, or biological evolution as an explanatory story for origins, but it points us in a different direction. So those are some of the big picture items. I mean, certainly it touches upon consciousness, as consciousness is importantly related to how I work out my understanding of personal identity. There's something unique about consciousness and what it tells us about who we are as persons. And I try to explore that and really press into that, and try to make some distinctions about what it is that we can discern about the nature of the self or subject that is what it is, and how it is that we can even know. So working through this sort of this kind of knowledge argument that we derive from consciousness, to a perspective or a wholesale portrait of the person itself, which I think leads you down this track to well, ultimately to God. And this is why so many dualists are connected. So well, I'm throwing out maybe a new term, but dualism. So I'm basically defending dualism. So it's in recent analytic philosophical discussions. So we're going to go back and forth between sort of the analytic philosophers, because they're having their own discussions oftentimes, and then the theological discussions, they're having their own discussions. So trying to bring these two together sometimes can be rather difficult, and it is difficult at times to get them to speak the same language and have a conversation. But in the analytic philosophical world, there's this whole problem in philosophy of mind called the mind-body problem. In recent history, somebody like David Chalmers called it the hard problem of consciousness. And that's been quite influential in the philosophical literature on mind-body relation. But I think, while it's a helpful sort of way to think about it. The hard problem of consciousness really is something that's been with us. It's really just the mind-body problem, how it is that the mind and the body relate to one another.
Mhm.
And interestingly, and I'm gonna probably frustrate some of the analytic philosophers out there, and that's okay. The David Chalmers's hard problem of consciousness and what he says and how he develops it, in some respects, it's really not all that novel, because Descartes was doing something similar in his day when he was responding to the kind of atomists or materialists of his day in trying to provide solutions to this mind-body problem. And he came up
Mhm.
with one solution. And obviously today, Descartes has become kind of the whipping boy in much of academia, and he's quite unpopular, although he's making his way back, arguably.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of the solutions that are provided now after some of these recent guys who have turned from materialism to some sort of dualism, they're
Yeah.
starting to look more and more like Descartes and his
Right.
view or his solutions to the problem, the original problem that's really been with us. Um, so hopefully I didn't go off on too much of a tangent. There's a lot of issues going on in the book, but there is a sort of a broad kind of introduction to why do we believe in souls in the first place, and then a more specific and particular argument for a brand of the soul itself,
Mhm.
or dualism, as you might call it, dualism, that we are minds and bodies, that we have there are these distinctive events of mental events as well as physical events or brain events that are different, and there are these properties that are borne out by these different particulars, namely the soul or mind and the body, and the properties that it has or the events that it gives rise to. And so so there's a general sort of argument for the soul in general. I make a more particular specific argument for a brand of the soul that reminisce or looks a lot like Descartes' view. I call it neo-Cartesianism, and I think
Yeah.
it looks a lot like Descartes. Whether or not he actually held this particular view
Right.
is up for debate historically.
Mhm.
Um, but and then I make a sort of more refined argument for that particular version and the entailment to God Himself. And I think there's an important argument therein when we start thinking about the nature of consciousness and knowledge that's entailed by it. When we think about reason, when we think about
Yeah.
experience, there's something about the nature of those mental items that are not fully explainable, capturable, identifiable, or even reducible to material things
Yeah.
or even material processes. And so they demand a different kind of explanation. So that's the big picture. That was
Yeah.
a, yeah.
No, and I love the fact that you mentioned reason and how it's related to the soul, and that's where your work and my work really kind of overlap a bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll get to that more later today. But okay, so you've given us some big picture items
Yeah.
in your book. But if you had to say, if you had to, I hate it when people ask me to do this, but if you had to say, here's one big takeaway I want everybody to walk away with after reading this book, what would it be? What's the main takeaway for everybody in the creation of self?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway is that not only is it unintuitive, but there seems to be a sort of problem with the sort of materialist explanations or the naturalistic explanations that we have on offer, um, whereby persons could come about through some sort of general way. The
Mhm.
fact of personhood or subject or subjectivity um, is what it is, defies the sort of generality or the anonymity that you might find in other views. So think of it like this. On many of the naturalistic views, which are the object of my kind of criticism, or pseudo-naturalistic views, as I would call them, where there is some sort of closed loop causal explanation within the natural world, or by way of physical explanation, or by way of some sort of biochemical explanation of what we come from. There's something about that universal, generalizable, regular process that I press into this intuition that could not give rise to me.
Mhm.
And because there's something about the nature of subjectivity, and that's really what I'm trying to press into. And there's a lot more works coming out now trying to press into this question of not just phenomenal experience, as the philosophers would call it, right? You know, phenomenal experience is this idea that we have these qualities that can't be quantified in mathematical terms or through physical terms. We have these qualitative experiences of, I like chocolate ice cream. I mean, I really like the Moose Track ice cream better than anything else. You know what the Moose Track ice cream is?
I don't know what that is.
It's like vanilla with fudge and these crunchy peanut buttery things.
Sounds good.
And so I like that. But the
I'm gonna have to
light,
check that out.
yeah, it's good. It's good. Yeah. And or the particular sound that I and the experience of that sound when I hear rock music or something like that. I like classic rock, and I like some of the newer metal. But you're a musician, right?
Yeah, I played rock and even metal for years and years, and I just got into the country rock scene recently. But
Country rock.
sorry,
Okay.
yeah, I apologize for that. But
No, it's okay. I don't know a lot about that, but they're blending all these different
that's right.
genres. They're coming
Yeah.
together in different ways. I mean, there's like Jelly Roll in his rap country.
There you go. Yeah, that's right.
That he's blended together, which is well, he's really kind of brilliant, isn't he? But he's a poet himself.
Yeah, yeah.
There's certain experiences that we have of Jelly Roll and his music that is unique.
Yep.
But there's something anyway about the nature of qualitative experience.
Mhm.
And I think this helps us when we think about our qualitative experiences. It helps us get back to this more subjective question that cannot be generalized, regularized. Nirvana is now considered classic rock. Somebody commented, "That's funny." Yeah, doesn't that make you feel old?
Oh,
It makes me feel old. Yeah. So
Thanks a lot, Idol Killer. You made us feel
can you
old
believe
today.
when was that? Like that's 30 years
91.
ago.
91 is when Nirvana came out because I was a freshman in college, my undergrad. I was 18.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
But it doesn't
Well,
feel that long. How old are you? You were 18 when?
91. Yeah, I'm 50.
Oh, you're older than me.
Yeah.
So you're really old.
That's right. How old are you?
I try to forget. 40. I think I'm 41.
Oh, you're just a kid.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That makes me feel a little bit better. Some days I feel like I'm experiencing midlife crisis. What have I really done? I've spent all this time on these philosophical and theological issues. What a waste.
No, that's this is some of the most important things a human could be doing right now. So yeah, you're advancing the conversation, contributing to the literature and things that people have been talking about for centuries. And you're the way I look at it is we need all these other giants. We need to stand on their shoulders. Or maybe if you think about it as playing a football game, they've advanced the ball toward the end zone of truth. And maybe they didn't quite get there all the way. So maybe they fumbled the ball. Now you've picked it up and you're carrying it toward the end zone of truth. So man, keep going.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, I mean, at one level, I think just to lighten the discussion, I think we've said a lot. There's a lot of complex things we probably need to kind of spell out, tease out, try to clarify. But yeah, I do think there is something going on in the wider cultural discussions that this is important for. I have different days where I'm like, yeah, this is really important work I'm doing. Yes. And then other days I'm like, oh, nobody cares
Yeah.
about this. But anyway, but there is an important discussion right now taking place in the wider popular discussions about the nature of consciousness. And we're seeing it a lot more, especially with discussions about computer intelligence,
Yes.
artificial intelligence, right? I mean, some of these questions have been with us for a long time. Like, can robots think, or could they ever come to a place where they think, or where they can know themselves, or where they could be consciously aware of themselves, and these sorts of
Mhm.
things. I mean, the whole literary tradition of the kind of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is kind of in the background of these wider
Mhm.
science, philosophy, religion discussions, and how it shaped our consciousness. But now, like, they're really coming to the fore. It seems in a more profound, impressing way, that are forcing us to ask some more specific questions about the nature of consciousness and intelligence, and what it is that we really like, what it is that we really believe about that, and
Yeah.
as Christians, what it is that we really believe about this, and how does this filter into our sort of bigger picture of the Christian worldview.
Mhm.
These are really hot, pressing issues, and
Yeah.
right now, I mean, in the wider discussion, there are lots of secularist views of consciousness.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, I would even call them atheistic views. That might be a little bit more crude, and some might take that as to be harsh, but at
Right.
least atheistic in the sense that there's a lot of views on offer right now that are getting a lot of press, getting a lot of press in Scientific American, getting a lot of press in other science discussions. Um, and many of them tend to be these sort of secularist views, or these atheistic views, insofar as I say it atheistic lightly, just to say that God has no robust role to play in
Mhm.
how it is that we're conceiving of consciousness in the cosmos, or the origins of the consciousness in the
Yeah.
cosmos.
Yeah.
God is playing no sort of robust way in those discussions. So
Mhm.
something like what I'm proposing in the book, which has a sort of, you might say, a tradition of thought. It goes back quite a long way historically, in philosophical and theological circles. Um, you might call it something like theistic dualism, because, as Descartes recognized, as Augustine recognized, there is this intimate relationship between God and the soul. There's something about the nature of the soul that points us back to God and prompts different questions about God himself, that secular alternatives, or atheistic alternatives of consciousness, can't explain. They don't have the resources to explain, it seems.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, they're still getting lots of press, and sort of
Right.
these theistic, dualistic views are not
Mhm.
getting the same sort of press. I mean, I wrote this, co-authored this article recently. There's been this big discussion between the panpsychists and the materialists,
Yeah.
and does your audience, they probably know what those terms are roughly.
Yeah, a lot of them, but some of them won't. I mean, I just read Goff's book in this last year, and I think I've talked about it here on this channel a little bit. But why don't you just briefly define some of those terms?
Yeah. So I think I went on a little bit of tangent. In the philosophy of mind and what's coming sort of to the fore, public discussions, there's kind of three broad views of mind, the mind body, or consciousness and body relation, or brain relation. There's materialism, there's dualism. Those are the two most common views that are perceived
Mhm.
out there. Materialism is the view that our consciousness is either identical or reducible to, in some way, our physical bodies, or brain
Yeah.
states, or something like that. Um, and there's dualism, the view that we are, kind of roughly going back to Descartes, although there are a variety of different views, of
Yeah.
course, not seeking to simplify it too much, but that we are souls and bodies, or minds and bodies, and these two exhibit two different types of events or properties that are distinct, and uh, importantly distinct, and not just in a linguistic sense, but in a more a richer, profound sense. And then there's this more popular view that has sort of come on the scene really as of late, called what you might call it sort of a third view, panpsychism. And panpsychism is getting a lot of press right now. It seems getting a lot of attention as materialism is kind of dying out, it seems.
Yeah.
And or at least a lot of people are starting to wonder if materialism can provide us a sort of explanatory story about mental events, consciousness, and what it is, or if it even has a kind of intrinsic nature that is material, or if we can explain it purely physically as a kind of physical behavior or along functionalist lines or something like that. So there does seem to be a kind of shift away from dualism. Well, dualism is kind of treated as kind of, that's eerie, that's kind of naughty, that's kind of like not very scientific. It's actually anti-scientific, right? You still get a lot of that general sense.
Right.
Even, I mean, in the academic philmine literature, but you're getting it in a lot of public context as well. This kind of eerie, right? And it doesn't fit within the scientific frame of the world. But as they're moving away from materialism, panpsychism is coming as kind of the alternative, which says basically this, following from Bertrand Russell, that there's something about the underlying physical stuff of the world, or physical particles, that either have consciousness or are consciousness disposed, or have particles that are disposed toward consciousness in some way. And of course, there's different ways of thinking about panpsychism. So I don't want to simplify that either, but it's kind of this idea that at the lower kind of base level, there isn't just physical particles in the way that it's conceived by physicalists or materialists, but there's something about the nature of those particles that is consciousness disposed, or has the properties that at some higher level could give rise, by way of these psychophysical laws, give rise to consciousness itself, or consciousness beings. So where was I?
Well, you had mentioned the panpsychism, and so then I said, why don't you define those terms?
Yeah,
and I can't remember where we were before you mentioned that.
Yeah, so I was mentioning an article we recently wrote about called "The Elephant in the Room: The Science of Consciousness," and it seems to me that, like we said before, there's a lot going on in the public sphere in terms of discussions about chatbots and whether or not chatbots are conscious and this sort of thing. And there's lots of further discussions right now going on about the science of consciousness. There was this big debate, I guess it was about 25 years ago, between David Chalmers and this neuroscientist and Christopher Koch, was it? I think it was. We can look it up on Google. Anyway, there was this big debate, and there was this big thing about there was a wager that we would kind of figure out consciousness in 25 years. Well, that 25 years is up now, and that promissory note that's been made by these materialists has not been fulfilled. And so panpsychists are coming on the scene now, and many of the panpsychists are not theistic. In fact, many of them are explicitly secularist or atheistic even. They're offering up this alternative that is getting a lot of press, even in the sort of materialistic science magazine, Scientific American. But you won't see, the elephant in the room is this: you will not see the dualist being given the sort of exposure that it deserves. You will not see theism or theistic dualism giving it the exposure it deserves, or being even considered or seriously considered in these sorts of wider discussions. And so that's the elephant in the room.
Yeah, it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, but my personal opinion is, and I'm not an expert on the history of all the literature and everything on this, but it seems to me that there's been many good arguments for the soul, and against naturalism or materialism, and that we need more than just matter in motion to get consciousness, and especially what I go even further with it, not just consciousness, being able to think of and about different ideas and of and about different competing hypotheses and whatnot, but the actual libertarian freedom to think through these things as well. But it seems to me that panpsychism, it just seems ad hoc. I mean, I think a panpsychist would have been laughed out of the room. And I think even Goff mentioned something to that effect in the book. And not too long ago, like during his career, he would have to be very careful and not tell people. I think it was in his book. I might have heard him say that elsewhere, but that he kind of had to keep his panpsychism hidden. But now it seems like it's favorable, and to me, it seems like maybe that's because we've done a good job of arguing against the materialistic view. But I do think this is an ad hoc response. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see how it's could be certainly perceived that way, and I think some do perceive it that way. I mean, some materialists will still, and thankfully, I mean, I think they're more kind of honest, and they're kind of standing firm and fighting for the materialism. They see panpsychism as a kind of a capitulation to kind of recognizing this sort of phenomenal quality, this even private quality of consciousness that science can't, or at least empirical science can't explain. We don't have access publicly to these properties. So they would perceive it that way. And dualists on the other side would see panpsychism, might see it in some ways as a kind of muddy middle, you might say, a kind of muddy middle that doesn't give sufficient credence to the robustness of mental properties or mental events themselves. And so you might say, especially those, I mean, historically, I mean, this is an important piece in the wider discussion. I don't know if we can make a strict sort of analytic argument to suggest that it's not true based on this, but the historical development of kind of panpsychism really coming on the scene. You're right. Goff does say something like that in his book, Galileo's Error, and he's talked about this in podcast, where he's like, he was kind of this materialist for a while, then he came around and he was kind of quiet, reserved about his sort of, I guess, more panpsychist views about consciousness. Because it wasn't popular for a while and it was kind of laughable. Not quite as laughable as dualism, but laughable nonetheless. So he does relay that. But I mean, but the whole history of panpsychism recently is very interesting and quite a commentary, I think. Quite a commentary in this way, at least, is that it seems to me that secularists want their science to do all or most of the explaining of things in the world and their origins, but also they recognize and they want their consciousness to be real and non-illusory or non-fictional. So they want to provide some story, some kind of explanation that doesn't require going all the way to God.
Yeah.
Or a theistic explanation. So
anything but that.
Yeah. And so as materialism is kind of being pressed a lot harder right now, it's up against a corner. You still have the hardline materialists who are standing firm, the identity reductive physicalists and the like, who are standing firm. Dennett, who doesn't really believe that he has intentional states in the sense that they have real causal efficacy in the world.
Yeah.
But most people don't really actually believe that, and they don't believe that when they wake up in the morning. But anyway, as that's kind of becoming not only less appealing, but also seems to be sort of sort of out of fashion, you're seeing kind of this panpsychism kind of take its place, or variants of panpsychism kind of take its place. And so it's a way to get the secularists and the atheists consciousness, but not having to pay for it by giving up their own atheistic commitments.
Yeah.
I think that's historically, that's the narrative. That's what's going on. You have this really even much smaller sort of minority of theists who are buying into something like panpsychism, but they're so small, it's they're not getting any press anyway. It's kind of a strange. They're kind of outside of the historical narrative altogether,
Right.
doing something different altogether.
Panpsychism to me just seems almost miraculous. That if it were to be true, you'd have to have God in the picture, making material things conscious. I mean, just because it seems like such a different kind of a thing.
Yes.
But yeah,
that's right. I agree.
Yeah, and I think, don't you even talk about that in your book a little bit? How it's just different kinds of things.
The panpsychism.
I might be. Yeah, I mean, I know you talk about it in your book.
I think I do talk about. Yeah, so I'm inclined in the book to say that something like a panpsychism that is more dualistically inclined, the way that somebody like David Chalmers is, that there are these two distinct sorts of substances at the fundamental level that give rise to these higher level organisms like you and I, that have these complex bodies and brains, but also have this sort of robust sort of first person consciousness, or first person perspective consciousness. That the lower levels, so like David Chalmers says something like this. He takes a more dualistic inclined sort of view that there are these sorts of stuff that's it's just consciousness, and then there's the physical particles. And so he interprets the base as being really in a kind of dualistic way. And there are some who have come along who might take that and say that, well, that seems to require some kind of theistic explanation for those dualistic entities, even at the base level. So I think I do talk about that briefly in the book, and I think it's right. If panpsychism ends up being true, then it would have to be of the sort that's more dualistic, similar to the kind of dualism that I'm defending.
Yeah. That's right. And as I think about it, as I was reading Goff, one thing that seemed to occur to me was that even if you could get consciousness and an ability to think of and about things, I didn't see anywhere where libertarian freedom would make sense in that view. I don't know if that's something you want to talk about, but what do you think about that?
Yeah. So there's three kind of big features in the free will discussion, and this does tie into the soul discussion. There is a relation. There's the question of rational deliberation, that feature, being able to account for rational deliberation. That seems to be a feature of being a free being. Of course, there's kind of the ownership feature criterion of freedom, and then there's the control kind of feature of freedom, and obviously the whole dialectic between kind of the determinists or even compatibilists. I mean, compatibilism is a way to try to make sense of responsibility in light of some sort of causal chain of conditional explanations of freedom. And libertarians would look at that and say, well, there's determinism isn't well, it's not compatible with with true freedom as freedom that's required to make sense of the kind of robust responsibility that we want and
Yep.
that we, you might say, seem to have or intuitively do have.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, you have obviously this more nuanced discussion in the literature about variants of compatibilism and how it is that we can make sense of at least two of the features. There is rational deliberation that takes place. There is kind of this ownership and the issue of control. Well, I don't know, but the classical compatibilists would say that desires are determining of the decisions you make. Decisions are conditioned upon that. There's sort of the hierarchical compatibilist that there are these sort of hierarchical framework that conditions the sort of the final decision that's made. And so the whole problem with libertarianism is that the argument is that there is no sort of well, this is Ayer's kind of problem that he raises. There is no way to kind of deal with the dilemma of if you don't have some sort of causal explanation, then you can't you don't have a good you have this sort of irrational sort of
Random.
consequence
Yeah.
or randomness. That's the question. So there are two types of libertarians, right? I mean, broadly speaking, there's the kind of event libertarians. J.P. Moreland, I was just going back to his book, Embody and Soul, and I think he's kind of reacting against the kind of causal sort of chain stuff that's typically associated with the sort of compatibilist view. But there's this sort of event libertarianism, like Robert Kane is sort of putting forward, or that says that at some that there are these causal conditions in place that give rise to the decisions that are made, and at some level there is a kind of a point of indeterminacy, so that there's not this infinite regress. But the more robust kind of libertarianism, kind of the agent libertarianism, I think that you're probably interested in, right?
Yep.
Because that's kind of more robust in the sense of it gives us the kind of responsibility that we think we need and we have. We actually feel that we have, we experience that we have. In other words, that there is, for making meaningful decisions in life, our meaningful decisions are not conditioned upon a causal chain, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's important. And something like that, I'm inclined to sort of like the, I think the sort of view that I'm defending of the soul, the sort of Cartesian view, actually does the best job of making sense of, if in fact that version of libertarianism is true, sort of all agent libertarianism is true, then it seems to be the most natural habitat in which we could make sense of that kind of robust libertarian freedom. So there was a book that I recently went back to, and I think it was an underappreciated academic book in the literature. It's a defense of Descartes' view, the sort of Cartesian view of the mind. John Foster, The Immaterial Self. It's a great book, but he actually deals with this this sort of issue of freedom and agency, where he's making it this sort of argument that the sort of most commonsensical, intuitive view that when I wake up in the morning, I literally have decisions before me that I can make, and my decisions might maybe probabilistically, based upon the reasons and based upon what I've done before, my preferences and desires and all that, I can I might be inclined, sort of affectionately inclined or something like that, or disposed to do one thing over the other because I'm habituated in that way. But there's a real sense in which, when I think about my own first person perspective, I can actually not only deliberate between these different decisions. And I not only own them in the way that I own my own thoughts and experiences, in a way that no one else owns it, in a way that no other biological organism owns it. I can actually rationally deliberate and own the decisions that I make. But I also, this further capability or capacity, right? We want to get after this sort of capacity issue. I can actually make a decision to, in the morning, go work out, or have a cup of coffee first, because I'm too lazy in the morning to go work out first, and I'd rather have my cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Well, I can make a decision, right? An actual decision. I have the ability and I have the control, even apart from my inclinations, my desires. I can make a choice either way. And so that sort of view is not compatible with any sort of mechanistic explanation, or even a mechanistic sort of psychological explanation, as you might have with other alternative theories of freedom that, place some causal constraints or conditions on the choices that we make. And so this is an area that's really fascinating. I'm not an expert on freedom or the literature, but because in the Cartesian view, we are literally metaphysically simple beings, and I am not made up of parts, literally, in the most fundamental sense. My consciousness is not even made up of the thoughts that I have or the experiences that I have. There's something underlying it that is fundamental to it, that is primitive. And there is, and because of that, there is, I use this term elsewhere, and I think this is accurate. I wish I had written this up in an article, but the Cartesian self is a metaphysically simple self, has these pluripotent powers, not powers that are like faculties or parts that are sort of disjointed or disconnected on some anthropologies, but literally they're kind of powers, pluripotent powers, you might call them, that give rise from the soul itself. This is how we can make sense of what John Foster calls intrinsic autonomy. And we want intrinsic autonomy because we don't want the volition as a part or as a faculty to be a sort of power that's conditioned upon previous powers or previous mental states, right, that give rise to whatever this decision is in this particular state, in this causal chain. What do you think about that? I think it's intrinsic autonomy. We want something like that. That's what John Foster says. That would give us the sort of robust freedom and responsibility that we want.
And I guess I'm not seeing that come along with panpsychism, even if we were to grant it. So I don't think panpsychism is true, but even if we granted it, I guess my point is I don't see where the powers of autonomy come from just mere awareness. So I've argued that mere awareness is not enough to be a rational, intelligent, being who can infer truth about ultimate reality. I liked it, I guess, with those powers, I compared it to driving. And I said, look, you're either behind the steering wheel and you're driving the ship of reason, or you're tied up, gagged and sitting in the back seat, merely aware of how something or someone else is driving. Yes. And I said, now there's a third option. You're tied up, gagged, and sitting in the back seat, and you're also tripping on acid, and you actually think that you're the one that's driving and that is in control of the ship of reason when you're not in control of anything. And I say that's the compatibilistic view. But what do you think?
I mean, I think you probably would have to opt for some kind of event causal libertarianism, or I think some have called it source libertarianism, that the interior states are, even if they're not physically mechanistically conditioned or causally determined, they are psychologically determined in some way. Um, um, I mean, at some level, you have to say something about. This is where Cartesianism does get kind of mysterious in the sense that you do have this radically unique type of substance that in one sense is very mysterious, but there's no, and so John Foster talks about this in his book. He talks about like this idea that when I feel like that I have the power to do it, and not just the power to do it if I choose, but the power irrationally or gratuitously to choose it in that way. It does raise the question about, well, how does reason play a role in our sort of decision making? But and we can choose, we can even rationally determine or make a choice based upon one reason or another reason, but there's something more primitive about me and my conscious states of awareness that is logically presupposed in the decision making itself, and is not causally determined by some precedent properties or psychological properties, even because there's already this logically presupposed primitive subject. And so I'm interested in the creation of self and arguing for this sort of primitive subject that really and truly does exist. That seems to make sense of the kind of robust libertarianism that you're after. And I think it's probably true. If it is true, then something like Cartesianism is probably, well, it's probably the view, the right view. Something like the sort of more complex theories of identity that are kind of part and parcel of this overarching generalizable process. Yeah, my intuition is to say that there's something about those views that would give some sort of precedence or determination to precedent or previous causes in the chain of cause and effect that would make some sense out of the freedom discussion that we're having. So yeah, I would be inclined to see panpsychism, particularly of the monist variety that Goff is after, as he would have to probably opt for one of the less robust versions of libertarianism if he's going to affirm libertarianism. And I think he actually mentioned this, and I've just started reading this portion of his recent book, the book Why he just came out with. I think he discusses this in his book. Can't remember exactly what he says, so I don't want to misquote him or anything. But yeah, I think he would have to almost certainly opt for something like that.
Do you recall if he was trying to affirm libertarian freedom in some sense or not? I haven't seen the Why book yet, so.
I think he is, but I
Really
think it's some sort of softer kind of libertarianism that gives some credence to precedent causes at some level.
All right, I'm gonna have to look into that.
Right. So
ASAP.
more the I don't know. I don't know exactly, and I don't want to press it because I'm not sure. But I would think some sort of weaker kind of libertarianism would have to be opted for.
Right.
But I'm committed, and so I don't want somebody in the chat world to come back and say, no, he believes actually in the most fullest, robust agent causal libertarianism. I don't think he does. I'm pretty sure he doesn't. But and I don't see intuitively, it would seem to be in tension with his sort of panpsychism.
Yeah, but he's not a determinist then. I don't want to, I know that you're not sure.
I think he gives some credence to I don't know. I think he gives some credence to indeterminism, but I don't want, I'm not sure.
Let's put the pause button on that. I want to get back to your book and not Goff's.
No, that's good. But his book is fascinating, I must say. And he's very interesting. Yeah.
All right.
It's relevant.
We've talked a lot about the soul and substance dualism, or at least dualism. Do me a favor. Let's just quickly define those two things for me, and then we'll keep going. But yeah, how do you define the soul, and then define substance dualism for us?
Yeah, yeah. So in the beginning, the first part of the creation of self, I am doing a kind of more general layout of substance dualism and the soul, insofar as I'm trying to explore what's famously called the knowledge argument
Yeah.
for mental events or consciousness. The knowledge argument, I mean, famously, um, uh, I keep wanting to go back to Howard Robinson because he developed a similar argument, but it wasn't. But he didn't get popular for it. It was basically the same argument, but it was.
Really?
But Frank Jackson got popular for it.
Yeah.
Don't you hate when that happens?
Yeah.
You come up with something and somebody else, you actually publish on it. Somebody else gets popular for it.
Well, that's what happened to Leibniz, and everybody then accused him of plagiarism.
Yeah. So anyway, he makes this argument that they're basically that Mary's in this black and white room, and Mary is the scientist, and she has studied kind of the science of consciousness literature. She knows all there is to know about the underlying physics of light. She knows all there is to know about neuroscience and sort of the neural correlates of consciousness. She can say a lot about, the sort of the science of colors and things of that sort, but she's never actually experienced anything beyond this black and white, this sort of kind of no color room, this monotone room. That she's never experienced red or blue. And so, but she knows all that there is to know about it. But one day she goes out into the world outside of this room, and she actually experiences red in the flower and blue in the sky. And then she says something like, aha, this is what it is. And she actually has this new experience, this phenomenal experience, philosophers call. So the original argument seems to be arguing for this idea that consciousness is epistemically radically distinct from physical knowledge, that there is this kind of phenomenal knowledge, and these are two distinct types of knowledge. And so I kind of extrapolate or sort of work on that and think about, well, what is it about our own knowledge states that we can say? What further facts can we develop from that sort of phenomenal physical distinction? So really, there's two common ways of thinking about knowledge. One is that we get knowledge by way of perception, and the other way is by way of introspection. There's something about the nature of introspection, the ability to look into my own kind of mind, my own thoughts, and think about my own thoughts. That is only private to me. It's not publicly available. You can draw neural correlates of consciousness by looking at a brain scan and talking to me, but you don't have the private experiences or the private thoughts that I have. And then there's perception. But even in perception, there's a distinction between what we infer about physical things from the more underlying fundamental fact about our consciousness, which is phenomenological or phenomenal, right? The likeness quality of something, the likeness quality that I have in virtue of my consciousness, right? And so, so I try to develop that and say that actually there are things that we can say about what it is that we're talking about when we talk about the soul. The soul is something like a subject of experience, and or phenomenal experience, as well as a subject of thoughts and intentions. Yeah. It's that kind of thing. And these are the kinds of characteristics or the features that describe what it is that is me, or what it is that is a mind more generally.
Do you
And
think, can I interrupt you
yeah,
really quick and ask you a question? Do you think that that would apply to God? Um, so even though he's omniscient, he knows the truth value to every proposition, so he can know all the facts about what it would be like to experience, or he would know, yeah, he would know the facts about pain, physical pain, but as the creator of all nerve endings, doesn't have nerve endings himself, wouldn't know that phenomenological experience until he became flesh and experienced pain for the first time, that what it is likeness. He would know the truth about pain, but do you think that he could actually know it experientially? Well, I don't think he could know it experientially until he walked as Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, what do you think?
yeah, yeah, that's a big question. So I think one of the things I try to extrapolate with reference to God, which is I think will help us get after this sort of question that you're after. I'm not sure. I would say, first of all, I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. I mean, there's different theses about like God being omnisubjective, so he has sort of access to all the sort of subjective states of awareness, and so he just exists that way as God himself. And even though he doesn't have my first person perspective, he has, well, maybe presumably his own first person perspective. And in the way that you have your first person perspective, that's not my first person perspective. And I don't have access to your first person perspective. Maybe God is more like that. I mean, at least at some level, I am working, and most of the theistic dualists are working with this sort of analogical reasoning at one level. There's that that at some fundamental level, there I mean, this does kind of tap into some sort of libertarian discussion as well, but I mean, maybe you could make sense of it as compatibilist. But anyway,
No, you
I
can't.
don't want to go down that trail too much.
No.
But
I'm sorry for interrupting your train of thought too. I just was wondering if we could think of God in a Mary type situation, in a black and Mary in the black and white room.
yeah,
Even though she knows the truth value to all of the propositions about color, she couldn't experience color until she entered into the world of color, so to speak. And I don't like you. It definitely have to be nuanced. I was just off the top of my head wondering if we could talk about God in that, at least in a similar sense, but maybe that's probably a topic for another video. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's difficult. I do think it's difficult. Yeah, I mean, at one level, it's difficult to say if God has this particular experience, because if he doesn't have this particular body in this particular place and way, it's difficult to say, right? I mean, if he's a disembodied entity or substance, it does seem, on the sort of Cartesian view that I'm laying out and the sort of theistic dualism with the sort of intuitions I have about the nature of consciousness, assuming God has consciousness and God is a sort of paradigmatic explanation of the fact that we are consciousnesses and we can make sense of consciousnesses in virtue of a paradigmatic consciousness, namely God, that God would have some kind of first person perspective himself, and that he would have access to his own thoughts in a private way that we do not have access to, and that he would have some sort of absolutist identity in the Cartesian sense that that we do not, and we do not share in, and he doesn't share in ours either in some way. Then it would seem that it would seem that he would have, and you do have some of these discussions in some of the finite theism literature, that God has would still have some kind of limited perceptual access to certain phenomenal states, and he would be limited maybe by knowing them maybe in a certain way, say a propositional way, but not knowing them in the sort of phenomenal way that you and I do in virtue of the bodies that we have.
Yeah.
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 I wasn't expecting you to go there, but yeah,
No, me neither.
that's right. That seems right. I mean, yeah, I don't know. And also I want to say, I don't want to commit to that view either, because before I
Right.
get in trouble with all the classical theists and the Calvinists and others that will take shots at me or something like that. But
Yeah. Welcome to my world. No, I did derail you there. Do you remember where you were going with that? You started talking about Mary and the black and white
yeah,
room.
I was basically trying to give some description of the soul that I developed through the sort of the knowledge argument and logical implications from the knowledge argument for the soul. The soul is basically, at the end of the day, a kind of subjective thing, a subject of thinking and a subject of experiences, and that's how I develop
and an immaterial thing as well, right?
It is immaterial, yeah, of course. Insofar as we're defining immaterial as non-physical, at least non-physical, and yeah, it is immaterial. So I do refer to it as an immaterial substance, and it's an immaterial substance in virtue of the kind of substance the unique kind of substance it is that has these immaterial events or mental events that are non-physical, explicitly non-physical in nature. There's this intrinsic nature that makes them that way. And one of the intrinsic features that makes them that way seems to be the private nature or property that minds have, or souls have. I'm using them almost synonymously. Minds or souls have, that have this private feature that bodies do not have, or it seems they do not have. There's no way in which, if they do have even an intrinsic nature that is distinct from the public properties that they do have, not only would we never know what they are, but it would raise questions about the realistic assumptions we're making in the scientific process when we're sort of investigating the nature of physical things themselves. There does seem to be this radical distinction between physical things as publicly accessible and mental things or subjects that are privately accessible and accessible only by the minds themselves. So you have your own private access and I have my own private access, and that private feature seems to be pretty close to a kind of descriptive feature of what it is to be a mind or a soul. And so that feeds into the question about, well, what is substance dualism? Substance dualism is this: there's two distinct types of things or entities: souls, minds, and bodies themselves. Physical things in the world, their bodies. And locally, you and I have a soul and a body, you have a soul and a body. That's substance dualism.
Okay. So if somebody's trying to, maybe they're taking notes and writing down, okay, what is a soul? How would you improve upon this? A soul is an immaterial thinking thing. Would you add something about private subjectiveness in there too, or what would you say?
Yeah, I would say, so Descartes works with this definition, arguably, that soul is a thinking thing, or mind is a thinking thing. And I think that's, I don't think that's wrong. I think there is something about the nature of thinking itself that logically demands a kind of distinct type of substance from the physical body. The physical body doesn't. Bodies don't think, brains don't think, I think, and there's something about the knowledge of my thinking that makes it my thinking,
right?
That is that sort of defies the sort of the idea that my animal thinks. So you have this whole discussion about, well, could you be an animal with a first person perspective? And it seems to me that in virtue of thinking, there's an implicit private feature of thinking, this capacity of the soul that seems to, there's other features as well, like intentionality and things of that don't seem to be sort of physical properties or physical property bearers. But there is this private feature that I have access to. I have access to my own mind, and I can rationally deliberate about the items in my own sort of conscious purview. But there's something about me having that, owning that, unifying those thoughts and experiences. There's something about that makes me me and not you me. There's something more. There's a more fundamental or primitive fact about me that is even logically precedent to the psychological attributes that I have, or the thoughts that I have, and thoughts and experiences that I have. Yeah.
All right. So I think this is a Hebrew name here. I don't know how to read it, but they ask, does he think animals have souls?
Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, in short, I do. Yeah, I do think
I do
animals
too.
have souls,
Yeah.
but I mean, the certainly not the sort of robust, the kinds of souls that have the sort of robust consciousness that human beings have.
Yeah. 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 I ask my dog all the time if he has a soul or if he is a soul, and he's never given me a clear answer. But the more my dog is now 13, and it just seems like every year that goes by, I'm more convinced that he is a soul that has a body as well. I know that he's conscious and can think of and about things that aren't even in the room. And it seems to me that he can think of the concept of a walk and knows how to communicate with me when he wants to go for a walk. Or so it's just, I don't know. I do. I have a blog that is called "All Dogs Go to Heaven," where I do argue that, and I try to back it up biblically as well. It's a stretch. It's a little bit of a stretch, I admit, but I think a loose case can be made that gives us a reasonable hope that not only do animals have souls, but they'll be in heaven.
Oh,
But
yeah. That's interesting. Well,
yeah,
it's funny when I was writing my doctoral dissertation for about a year, I was reading up on mind body stuff and dualism, and I was becoming more attracted to dualism. And we had this big boxer named Bentley, and every day I would ask him, "Hey, are you thinking right now? Are you conscious?" He's a big boxer, and boxers are very emotional dogs, as you may know.
yeah,
They're very emotional, and so I would ask him, as I was kind of trying to deliberate and introspect about my own thoughts, whether or not this dog had consciousness. I do wonder if certainly they don't have the sort of robust first person consciousness that we do. It's hard.
right,
I mean, they have some sort of lower level rationality, rational
yeah,
deliberation. I mean, I guess they have ownership of whatever things that they do, thoughts, but it does make me wonder if they have this what beyond their own conditioning and their own sort of natural instinctions, what kind of control they have over their
right.
own decisions.
Yeah, I don't think they've
Not
got libertarian
libertarian
freedom.
freedom, do
Yeah,
they? They don't have libertarian freedom, do
no,
they?
I don't think so. I don't think so. But I
So,
think, yeah.
what would make them sufficient for qualified for heaven?
Because because they don't have libertarian freedom, or at least access to it yet. Because I think my dog is probably along the lines of a young, a toddler, maybe a 2 or 3 year old at this point. And as I wouldn't say a 2 or 3 year old is um, is morally accountable. They haven't yet reached the age of moral accountability.
Yeah.
So animals, I don't think any animals are morally accountable because they're also not rationally responsible. If you're not rationally responsible, you're not morally responsible, as I've argued. And I think, but they have to have something soulish in them to be able to experience even these lower levels. I don't think it's the same kind of love that humans can have. We can have maximal love with our creator and with others. Animals have a more
They at least have
primitive.
phenomenal consciousness, right?
Yeah, right.
They
There's no
experience
doubt. There's
happiness.
no doubt in my mind that my dog can think of and about things, even abstract things to an extent, like a walk, even though he's not thinking of it in those terms. If he wants to go for a walk, he goes and finds his harness and picks it up in his mouth and brings it over to me because he knows that I've got to put that on him first before I put the leash on him to take him out for a walk. And so he's thinking of a walk when he goes and gets his harness. And so that just kind of, I mean, it might seem like a simple thing, but as I philosophize about those little actions and the thought process he's going on in his
Yeah,
mind,
no, it is fascinating. It is fascinating to think about. They certainly have
Yeah.
phenomenal consciousness, it seems. I mean, my dogs always like certain kinds of food better than others, right? They love red
Yeah.
meat, don't they?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And they would prefer that over probably their dry dog food.
Right.
Um, so are they rationally determining? I don't know, but no, it is interesting. So you're parallel to you would say dogs are not morally responsible in a similar way as a child who has not reached some sort of age of accountability is not
Yeah.
morally responsible, and
Mhm.
so they're kind of so dogs are kind of like they have the cognitive capacity of your 1-year-old
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something
I
similar,
think so.
right?
Yeah. Now, yeah, folks will have to take a look at my blog on freethinkingministries.com. It's called All Dogs Go to Heaven. And I also argue that that applies to all animals except for spiders, because spiders are literally demons. I'm just kidding. No, I argue
My
that.
wife thinks that too. Yeah,
Yeah. I don't like spiders, but
they all came in
um,
fall, right?
I do think that that at least there's I think, was it Lewis or I can't remember, somebody called them soulish beings. At least dogs and mammals are soulish kind of beings. Um, and yeah, I I give an argument that I don't hold to extremely tightly. So it's very loose grip, and I say, but it gives us a reasonable hope. So if you're an animal lover, um, uh, and your dog passes away, you have a reasonable hope that you'll see him again. So that's what I hope for, anyway.
Megan O'Geeblin, in her book, fascinating, really interesting book that called God, Human, Animal, Machine. And this is the sort of train of thought we're leading into when we start asking whether or not dogs have consciousness and even have souls, and could they exist in the afterlife. She suggestively raises the question that she gets this. Her whole book starts off with this package that she gets in the mail of this this robot, this AI robot dog that she
Hmm.
has, and she unpacks it and you know turns it on or whatever, and it responds like a dog,
Yeah.
and it reacts to her in various
Hmm.
ways. And I think it even has the greater complexity to learn different reactions at more
Right.
complex levels, quantitative levels. So, in the course of her sort of reflecting on her robot dog, she she starts to get a little confused, and she starts asking, well, maybe it is conscious, or maybe robots could be conscious. And then eventually she deals with the afterlife question, because she's kind of putting forward this transhumanist perspective that, well, there is an afterlife, but it's kind of It's an afterlife in this a different sense than what we would conceive of as in the traditional sense of afterlife,
Mm.
right? But she raises that question, and this is the sort of train of thought that we kind of we kind of are geared toward is if the dog is conscious, well, maybe a machine is conscious. Now, I don't think machines are actually conscious. I think we
Yeah,
can give reasons why they're not, that are distinct from why we would say dogs are probably conscious.
right.
But that
Yeah.
anyway, it's an interesting thought experiment that I mean, she goes down the sort of different path, and she wants to say that they are, and that sort of that question seems to be in the popular consciousness alive and well, whether or not robots or AIs could become conscious at
Yeah.
some point.
Yeah. Okay, man, there's so much I want to ask you about. Um, okay. I want to ask you about the metaphysical possibility of a purely physical thing being conscious. And then also, but before I get there, if all animals went to heaven, would we have a population problem? That assumes that God can't create a new heavens and new earth that's not big enough to uh, allow all these creatures to live there. I don't think that's a problem for God. But the good question. But to
That's a
get
fun question. Yeah.
what's that?
Well, is heaven even physical? Well, that's a question, right?
Yeah. I guess okay, man, we're gonna go on so many tangents here. Okay, I'm gonna write that down. Is heaven physical? Maybe we'll get back to that one. But let me ask you, do you think it's even metaphysically possible for a purely, because I mean, obviously, and I don't want to be accused of begging the question here because we we think that humans and animals uh, have consciousness because, well, maybe that's how that is part of what has contributed to the idea of a soul. So since a purely physical thing
Yeah.
probably doesn't have a soul, and I've heard some people say that in the movies or the Transformer movies that they actually have a soul imparted to them. I don't know if that's true or not, but I guess I can imagine
Yeah.
God putting a immaterial soul into a robot.
Yeah.
Maybe. But yeah, so otherwise, do you think it'd be even metaphysically possible for a computer or robot or any other purely physical thing to have intentional states of consciousness,
Hmm.
let alone the freedom to think? What do you think?
Yeah. So yeah, so this is good. This is interesting. So obviously, in the Cartesian view, there are these questions about body swapping possibilities, and if it's possible that my soul could be kind of fit to other types of lower level physical organisms and things of that sort. Um, at one level, I think it's more likely that my soul could inhabit another body, although it would be unnatural. There would be
Right.
something about the inhabiting of another body that would be unnatural for me. Um, um, but a lower level physical organism, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think there is something about the functional complexity of the soul's capacities that are fit for a complex body, in which the body and the brain are fitting arrangements that 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 interact in a functionally integrative way that makes sense. There's reasons why we've had so much success in neuroscience and in sort of brain mapping and doing sort of uh, drawing up all sorts of physical data about the neural correlates of consciousness. We can point out that there's all these correlations between these various conscious states of experiences with these brain patterns or these neural events in the brain. There's something about the fittingness of this soul with this body that makes sense of the fact that we encounter and experience the world in the way that we do through this body, that would be unfitting for our at least, well, our souls are metaphysically simple, but complex in the sense that we have a complex set of faculties, not faculties, but powers. I don't like to use the language of faculties, but powers. We have this complex set of powers, and the neurology that our souls are sort of interacting with, arguably, make that a more fitting environment or not. And so when our brain is impaired in certain ways, it really does literally affect certain states of consciousness. I mean, the most kind of simplistic kind of illustrations would be to think about, when I'm really tired and I wake up in the morning and I drink a cup of coffee, and the coffee wakes up my brain,
Right.
my neurochemistry. And so when it does wake that up, well, I experience in a way that there's something about the core, the interactive relation between my soul and my brain that is fitting for me to experience the world in a different way when my brain is more active. My neurons are firing better. In another simplistic explanation that makes sense of the fact that our brains and our souls are functionally integrated in a deep and intimate way is that, well, the simple fact that when I hit my head on the table in front of me, when I go down, when I accidentally hit it, well, it affects my states of awareness and in complex ways. There's something about the fitting structure of this brain with this soul that makes this soul sort of function better. And this is where precisely you get into this whole dialectic with materialist about, well, let's take that train of thought further. I mean, if there is this functional, integrative, or intimate relation between our consciousnesses and our brain states, then maybe it's that behavioral or functional reality that is explained completely or comprehensively by the brain itself. And I think that obviously that's going too far. There's something that is not captured by the neural states or the neural events themselves. That's not capturing consciousness, but nonetheless, there is an intimate, functionally integrated relationship that's fitting. And so we need to think about the functional relationship between this soul and this body that's fitting in a way that would be unfitting for this soul with a sort of lower level physical animal. So that's a long way to say it would, I mean, could God sort of, put us in an animal's body, put
Or a robot.
or a robot even. Yeah, I mean, there's Balaam's donkey, right, in the Old Testament, right, that kind of prompts this question. Maybe I'm not sure how to make sense of that, but you have this sort of human-like communication from the donkey, right, in the story, and
and we've seen enough movies with talking animals that I think it's easier for us to conceive of that. And of course, we've seen obviously robots talk, and we experience that today in a sense with ChatGPT. But I actually had a fun conversation, kind of a debate with ChatGPT. I've published that on this channel, and
you did? Oh, cool! That's fun.
I actually kind of got it to change its mind on indirect doxastic voluntarism and libertarian freedom. Had some really cool things come out there. People want to see that video. I've got that here, but yeah, I mean, I have a hard time thinking that, I could build a purely physical robot and I could program it to respond different ways and even program it to respond like an advanced AI. I still don't think it really thinks of and about things and has intentional states of consciousness, let alone libertarian free thinking. And in fact, the ChatGPT admitted that much to me. So it seems to me that it seems metaphysically like it is probably metaphysically impossible for a purely physical machine to have a immaterial, to have an immaterial thinking thing conjoined with it somehow. And unless God did another miracle, which I think he did with us. So in that sense, I can conceive of it. But apart from a miracle, I have a hard time conceiving of that. What do you think?
Yeah, well,
you're a creationist. I guess for me, before I read your book, I would lean toward traducianism. All right, we're throwing new terms out there. But now you got me thinking, okay, if it's creationism, well, maybe I can conceive of it differently, but help me out here.
Yeah. So I think, okay, so there's a couple issues going on here. So there's the question about the relation between the soul and the body. And there's this functional arrangement that seems to be fitting. I mean, at some level, the language is going to break down. And I mean, if we take this sort of Cartesian approach, which I think we should, and I think implicitly many do, whether they're willing to admit it or not, or commit to it, they do implicitly. There is going to be this sort of, as John Foster puts it, I mean, he talks about it in his book, but he also talks about it in an article that was written in 2001 called A Brief Defense of Cartesian Dualism. And he talks about the body and different bodies, and he talks about the soul, and he talks about the functional relation, the sort of relation that, relation in the analytic sense. How do we make sense of this robust functional relation between the body and the soul, this mind-body problem? And he, in his very Cartesian way, gets to this point where he's like, well, we can say all these things from common sense. We can say all these things from neuroscience about how there does seem to be this functional arrangement, this intimate relation between the mind and the body, or the soul and the body. But at the end of the day, there is something about the functional relation or the functional arrangement that that cannot be quantified, cannot be scientifically measured, that is not explicable in sort of in a purely public way. Why? Well, because of the very private nature or the private marking of the mind itself, that mark or feature that defines the mind that that we have, that we think, and that we experience. There's something about that that is mysterious, and there's no sort of scientific or deterministic way. Certainly, sorry, I have something in my eye real quick. There's nothing deterministic about the functional arrangement of this soul with this body that can be determined. Right. This is related to the other generating problem that I spend the latter half of the book trying to develop, flesh out. There's nothing about this body that I can point to and say in a sort of definitive epistemic way, this body is my body it is my body. And there's different ways in which I can think about this. There are certain structural relations, robust relations that I can even talk about as to why this is my body and how I experience the world. There's different things epistemically I can say about that that's complicated. There's things about my own psychology that I can say that are in a complicated way related to this body and not somebody else's body. But at some fundamental level, the Cartesian does have to say, as Foster indicates, and I think he's right, that this becomes a pretty not only intuitive, a fertile ground for thinking about theism or an argument for theism. There is no scientifically physical, quantitative way in which to make determinant why this soul is related to this body, right? At a different level, there, from a different view perspective, we can say a lot about the relation, and even at a more not fundamental, but at a deeper level, I can even say more from my own personal experiences and developmental psychology, why it is that this is my body. But at the most fundamental level, there is not a metaphysical materialist explanation why this soul is connected to this body. Mm-hmm. The more even, and so I step back from what Foster is even saying, step back even further to this more fundamental intuition. Not only can I not explain the relation, this is why creationism is necessary. If I can't explain that relation determinatively, or even indeterministically, right? Further, I can't infer or discern why it is that this soul would come from this body, which a naturalistic view would have, or even pseudo-naturalistic views are trying to make sense of why it is that this soul comes from this body. I can't. There's nothing about it that makes sense of it. There's nothing, not only intuitively, there's nothing about it that does the work for me sufficiently, that supplies the sufficient identity criterion to make sense of why this soul is this body, or why this soul comes from this body. And furthermore, I mean, I think you can even, which I try to spell out later on in the book, you can even derive a certain sort of apparent or seeming sort of contradiction. If you were to say that this body produced this soul, then you would either have to say that it does so deterministically, in a way that there were certain psychophysical laws at some complex high level that came about in such a way that when this very, very specified complex sort of arrangement came to be, I came to be. Mm-hmm. Right, which would be deterministic, and then you'd have these sort of weird psychophysical laws or something that would bring or give rise to me. But then that would raise the question, well, if there are these deterministic laws, even if there's one singular deterministic law for me that makes that I come about from, well, I mean, at least in one sense, you could reproduce that in theory and make it happen again.
How could I reproduce that?
Well, you'd have to have the right sort of scientific knowledge.
Oh.
We probably don't have, but theoretically,
right.
If we did have it, if it is so in the realm of science, if this is a theoretical possibility, then in theory, if I had the right sort of knowledge, right, if I were Mary and I knew all that was to be known,
how to organize all the parts together. Are you talking about an emergent view?
Yeah,
right.
That would actually be an interesting paper.
Yeah, it would.
Okay. Thought experiment in putting it here in terms of, what if Mary knew all that there was to know, then she could reproduce me deterministically.
Right.
Or let's say it's indeterministic. We live in an indeterministic world. At least probabilistically, it's possible that I could be reproduced. That not only rubs against my intuitions about the subject itself and my subjectivity, it seems to lend itself to other serious problems about there being, we can think about different thought experiments from like, twin worlds or something like that, or we can motivate these intuitions by thinking about zombie twins or ghost twins and things like that. There would be this possibility, at least in theory, that I could be reproduced if I were a product of this generalizable process connected by way of these psychophysical laws that gave rise to me at some sort of very specified and very complex arrangement of the cells that I have here. And
which seems metaphysically impossible to have two yous.
Yeah,
right. You'd be looking at the other guy saying, "You're not me."
Yeah, that's right. Right.
You don't want to get tortured. You might not care about that other you, but you don't want to get tortured.
That's right.
So, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So it does, and that's where I push the argument. It does seem to be a contradiction. Yeah. Now, I leave open the possibility to some extent. I say, well, if you leave open the possibility, then there's all these questions like, what's the difference between the identity I have to myself and, say, a perfect duplicate? A duplicate self that's perfectly duplicate, say.
Physically.
It's highly theoretical, but it's conceivable. And this conceivability is trying to push us toward imagining the impossibility that it is. It does seem to be an impossibility. There is nothing publicly, objectively generalizable. There is no law, it seems, the way that laws work, that I could be given rise to by purely physicalist, mechanistic, objective processes. And so this is why it pushes me toward the creationist perspective. There's not even, and that this is, you could be maybe a traducianist, but a traducianist is the view for your audience, maybe that there's different ways to work this out, but that there's some kind of like psychological material, or there's sort of the soulish stuff, or the souls are the kinds of things that physile or are prurient or something like that. And that, so it's still, there's still an affirmation of the soul, at least historically in the discussions of traducianism. They're non-materialistic in some way. There's something
still created by God.
There's some level at which you are still created by God. At least I think historically the way they define it, most theologians define it, is that at one level at least there's one, if not two persons that are directly and immediately created by God. And then God sets up this sort of complex specified design arrangements such that progenitor souls could give rise to other souls in the generative process.
Yeah.
But it still raises the question about the generation process, whether or not there would be some sort of objective set of generalizable conditions that could be met that would give rise to you rather than the perfect duplicate you. What would that mean, and what would make determinate that fact that makes you rather than your perfect duplicate you? And this is where it prompts us to raise the question about a sufficient designation of what conditions need to be met that make you and that make me, given that I am a primitive thing, fundamentally me, even apart from my properties or the psychological makeup or the bodily makeup or the neural makeup or the chemical makeup. There's something about me that makes me that is even more primitive to those things, is fundamental to those things that make me. What is it? And what is the sufficient identity causal explanation or identity conditions that need to be met that make me me.
Mm.
And no complex theory seems to add up to make sense of that.
Yeah.
And this is where it pushes me to the sort of creationist intuition.
Yeah. And that's the idea that God creates each individual soul
Directly and immediately.
Yeah. Now, would that be at the moment of conception, or where do you think that happens?
Oh yeah, I think it is at the moment of conception, and I think at least probabilistically, epistemically, we have good reasons to think there's a soul present from the moment of conception. I mean, actually, Foster has a good article on this as well, because there's a lot of objections to Cartesianism from this line that would suggest to say, well, Cartesianism opens up some sort of indeterminacy with respect to how we make determinate scientifically whether or not a soul is present in the embryo or something like that, right? Or when it is present, right?
Mm-hmm.
It raises those sorts of fuzzy boundary questions, right?
Yeah.
I mean, epistemically, I think we have good grounds for thinking that it is present, or a soul is present, person is present. We don't have any good reason to deny or to think otherwise. I think we should treat it as such, as if it were a person, and the person is literally and truly present, and that the cognitive development of the soul, the complexity of the soul's psychology will develop over time.
Yeah.
Even if that complex development isn't there immediately, or even is publicly discernible, we have good reason, I think, to think that there's a soul present there that's simultaneously sort of interacting with the body, as both the body is developing as well the soul is developing in a complex way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I think it is present at conception. I think, with most things, having infallible certainty, I don't think we have that, but I think we don't have that with most things. I think we have really good reasons to believe that it is that way. Probabilistically, it is that way, that the soul is present from the moment of conception, that embryos, even if they're underdeveloped, are not soulless, and we should treat them as such, that they are ensouled beings.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the idea that if it's even possibly a person, you better treat it as a person.
Yes.
Better safe than sorry, right? So let's shift gears here a little bit. We've been going for close to 2 hours now, so we should probably maybe go a little bit more rapid fire, and I'll try not to distract you as much as I have been. But what are the main reasons why you believe in the soul? You're going to sum that up for us.
What are the main reasons?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's getting okay. We just took a deep dive. Now we have to step back, right?
Right.
Big reasons why I believe in the soul. I think the big reasons are that you have these features of consciousness, the mental life, that lend themselves to logically presupposing a substance, and not just any old substance, but a substance that stands behind or is presupposed as the ground for these radically distinct types of epistemic characteristics of the mind, namely phenomenality, phenomenal experience, intentionality. We have actual intentions when we think about objects. We think about them as being, we think about them in a certain way. Privacy, that we have some sort of private access to our own minds. You have private access to your minds. I have private access to my mind. I don't have private access to your mind. And further, even introspection is related to that I can actually think about my own thoughts and think about it in a deep and robust way, in a way that you can't. There's something about the nature of the unity of consciousness, the unity of my consciousness, that lends itself to a distinct type of thing that has that binds my thoughts and experiences together, that unifies the thoughts and experiences, that provides a sort of metaphysical ground for those thoughts and experiences, that is logically presupposed and is different from the physical object itself. Physical objects don't seem to have these types of things based upon all that we already know about physical objects themselves. But there's an even more fundamental reason why this is. Well, there's a couple things that can be said. Epistemically, my phenomenal consciousness is epistemically prior to my knowledge about physical objects in the world, even my own physical object, the body. So I only know things through my own phenomenal awareness, and all my knowledge about physical objects are mediated by my own phenomenal conscious experience. So there's at least, at a very minimum, this sort of fundamental sort of epistemological dualism that is very Cartesian in nature.
Yeah.
So how do you make sense of that epistemological dualism? A soul, or a non-material thing, an immaterial thing that has these things, that owns these things, not some other way. But furthermore, if there's some fact about me that makes me me, that is not my body, that I know directly and immediate, epistemically, I have private access to this sort of positive feature that makes me me, this fact that makes me me, there's that I can discern by way of my own knowledge that I derive from my consciousness. There's something about me that makes me me that is not my body. And that raises the question about how it is that we get at some sort of designation of the self or the subject in question. And I think we actually do know that we are not our bodies.
Yeah.
And so that positive knowledge, or that access that I have to my own conscious states of awareness about myself, is reason why I believe in the soul, or an immaterial substance of some kind that is not my body.
So, okay, I'm looking up here. In a paper I recently wrote with J.P. Moreland, we shared this in the footnotes. And I think it touches on what you just said. So it's 7 steps here. But he says, the law of identity is true. If X is identical to Y, then whatever is true of X is true of Y, and vice versa. 2, I can strongly conceive of myself as existing disembodied. 3, if I can strongly conceive of some state of affairs S that S possibly obtains, then I have good grounds for believing that S is possible. 4, therefore I have good grounds for believing of myself that it is possible for me to exist and be disembodied. 5, if some entity X is such that it is possible for X to exist without Y, then 1, X is not identical to Y, and 2, Y is not essential to X. 6, my body or brain is not such that it is possible to exist disembodied, i.e. my body or brain is essentially physical. And then finally, 7, therefore I have good grounds for believing of myself that I am not identical to my body or brain, and that my physical body is not essential to me. So do you think that's basically concluding what you just said there, that we know we're not? I mean, JP says he has strong reason to believe that he can survive the death of his body. Well, I think is that what you're saying too?
Yeah, I mean, okay. So yes, I think so. I'd have to look at the argument again, but it's a modal argument. You guys are making a sort of modal argument for the soul, and I find modal arguments. I'm strongly sympathetic to them, and I like them. I would say, I think that's right, and I do generally. I would agree. I think that the modal argument works better if we have positive knowledge or knowledge about the self that precedes the modal possibility, the possibilities question, the possible worlds. So this is a more kind of more complicated discussion. But the way that I'm conceiving of the self is a primitive that's not dependent upon any sort of properties, body or psychological properties. It's certainly not a bundle thing. It is certainly a substance, but it's a substance of a particular kind. It's a primitive substance. What I'm saying is in a more complicated way is more radical than some dualists are wanting to claim. Some dualists are wanting to apply the principle of the indiscernibility of identicals, that we kind of individuate souls by way of their properties. And I'm saying something more fundamental, that there is actually properties don't do the work that people think they do in terms of individuating the identity of souls, but there's something more primitive. So so whereas that principle would apply to all other physical objects or things that exist by way of sort of public discernibility, the soul is the kind of thing that is wholly distinct in itself, in a intrinsic sense. It's distinct, even apart from its properties. So that's a more abstract, complex sort of claim. But I wonder if the argument is dependent upon that principle. I'm not sure. I can't remember all the steps. So a lot of people would not sort of go quite as far as I've gone in terms of individuating the identity of souls.
Okay.
Did I just jump off on a deep end?
No, I mean, yeah, and I should probably when we're done here share that argument in the comments so people can see it. But I mean, I just wanted to jump on the fact that I think you said something that we know we're not identical to our bodies. Is that what you said?
Yes, that's right. I think we do.
So how do we know that? I mean, I agree with you, but if somebody's going to push back and say, no, we don't know that, what would you say?
Gosh, well, I would say, are you having a thought right now? Yes. Okay, good. What's your thought? Okay. X, you're having a thought about X. Do I have a thought about X? Okay. Maybe I'm having a thought about X now. Do I have the thought about X that you're having about X right now? Do I have the same access to the thought about X that you do? Well, if it's a public property, then I do, but there's something still that remains unaccounted for. Do you know that thought? And so if I mean, we could go back and forth about, in this sort of discussion or dialectic and say, well, what is it about you that you have access to? I think when we grant that there is a something that is having both thoughts and experiences, we have to try to make some sense out of the accounting of those thoughts and experiences. And then we're in we're in the realm of where we need to sort of explore what it is that is accounting for it. And it is something that I don't have access to directly, at least in the what of your thoughts and experiences.
Mm.
And I can't discern it through empirical means. So what is it that is accounting for your thoughts and experiences? So either we're left with sort of this property bundle, not either. Maybe we're left with a property bundle. We're left with a something I know not what when I speak of myself, or I'm left with something I know of because I have direct access to it,
Right.
in virtue of the conscious states that I have about myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that may not ultimately convince, but maybe later on down the line.
That you have direct access to the fact. You can't speak for others, but you have direct access to the fact that you know you're not identical with your body.
Yes, that's
Right.
right. In virtue of the fact that I am the substance, the type of substance that has both thoughts and experiences. And so this is a weird thing. If I were a physical object of some sort, well, I mean, I can't be if I have actual positive knowledge of myself as the kind of thinking and experiencing thing that I am. If I were a physical object, then epistemically it would be very strange. We would be back in this other discussion about what to do to metaphysically account as a physicalist for those for the subject of thoughts and experiences. But there would be this sort of, you'd have to come up with this really queer physicalism that isn't even on offer in the discussion. We don't even, precisely because the phenomenal properties that I have mediate for me the physical object in question that I have knowledge about. Now we're getting really abstract, huh?
Yeah.
There's
Okay,
something, there's a sort of gulf between what we know from consciousness in one way, particularly through phenomenal knowledge that is entailed by our own conscious states of awareness. There's a gulf between that and the knowledge about physical objects, because those are always mediated or known through the intermediator of our own phenomenal knowledge.
Okay.
So there is, as some Cartesians would say, who wouldn't go as far as I do, there is clearly this epistemological dualism that is present.
That you only have access. There's things private to you that aren't public.
Yeah, I think that's one way of putting it. But there's certainly phenomenal knowledge that's not. Phenomenal knowledge is at least logically prior to physical knowledge.
Right. Okay. That I like. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Phenomenal knowledge is logically prior to physical knowledge.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you got time for a few more questions?
Sure.
Okay. I mean, you've been here for a long time.
Yeah. See, I got to pick up my daughter at some point. Yeah. Soon.
What's that?
Oh, we got some time. Yeah. I do have to pick up my daughter here soon.
Yeah. Okay. Let's rapid fire. You talk about in your book Cartesianism and Neo-Cartesianism. How do you differentiate between the two?
Yeah. So Cartesianism is Neo-Cartesianism is basically Cartesianism beefed up, particularly with this more nuanced view of the soul as a primitive thisness, a primitive essence of the subject. So in my development of sort of knowledge that we have via consciousness, there's certain features that are common to Descartes, Cartesianism, that we've talked about, the irreducibility of consciousness, the ineliminability of the I, say, for example, the authority of the I epistemically, and these sorts of features that are common to Descartes. The Neo-Cartesian view is basically a beefed up, refined version that tries to say that we know more than that. We know something positively about the soul that we were just talking about. So it's a beefed up, updated sort of Cartesianism.
Okay, yeah, and that's your view.
Yes.
Neo-Cartesian. Okay, cool.
Yes.
All right, so next question. Tell me your thoughts on the soul and its relationship to the pineal gland.
Yeah, this is a common objection. In Descartes, I think somewhere he said something like, the primary connecting point between the soul and the body is the pineal gland. And of course, the science has changed since then. And so that's been sort of mocked and derided and the like. Yeah. But I mean, this raises a more fundamental question about the nature of souls as being spatial, and if they are spatial or not. And if they are spatial, where are they located? If they are spatial, are they spatially located just generally speaking, where my body is, or some specific place in my body? Or are they spatial in the sense that my active powers are somehow localized and constrained by my body? I think that's true. But how we give some sort of explanation or a say of spatial location, mental spatial location, I don't know how to make sense of that. I don't know how to answer that. So the whole question about whether or not the soul is located in this part of my brain or this part of my wherever, it's a question that I don't think the dualist, the soul view, needs to answer, really. I think certainly my soul powers are constrained by my body and my brain in some way, limited in helpful ways, positive ways, but they're not spatially located beyond my powers being sort of localized to this body.
Yeah. Are you, I think, did I read on the back of your book that you had, yeah, I'll just ask you, are you an idealist?
Yeah, that's a good question. So so when people,
let me throw that at you.
It's interesting. Yeah, because I think, I'm certainly a Cartesian. So what I do with the body is a question that's even up for further discussion. Yeah. Even what I do with the body and the creation of self could lend itself to a more robust version of idealism, and even an idealist view of the body or an immaterialist view of the body that is not as intuitive or not what we normally think of. I typically stick, especially in broader conversations, I typically stick with, I'm a dualist of a sort. Right. And I believe in the soul, and I give some precedence to the mind, a mind first ontology, God first ontology. But I think it could be, at the end of the day, the body could be an immaterial.
Right. If that's the case, then the whole, how does a soul move a physical body? Well, that problem goes out the window. How does the immaterial thing?
You're inverting the whole ontology to root the physical stuff in mental ideas or mental experiences themselves. So it does seem to be a simpler explanation in that way.
Yeah. Do you know who Michael Jones is?
I'm open to it. I've obviously been exploring it in other contexts and places. And toward the end of the book, I do suggestively say that it could be this way.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, because you were the editor of a Routledge book on idealism, right?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
So,
Yeah.
do you know who Michael Jones is on YouTube? He goes by Inspiring Philosophy. He's
Oh, I've heard of him. I
yeah,
don't know him
yeah.
real well.
So he and I were just at a conference speaking at the same conference in Houston or outside of Houston about a month ago. And when it was over, he and I got into this big conversation about the difference between substance dualism, because, I'm a substance dualist and, he's this idealist. And at the end of it, I was like, okay, you made a really strong case philosophically and scientifically for idealism. Is
Yes.
it, I'm like, okay, I can see your case. And really I think what it boiled down to is, but he still speaks as a substance dualist and would say, in a manner of speaking, he's still a substance dualist. He's just like, and I think this was more in my words, but basically at the end of the day, is your body composed of atoms or ones and zeros or information? One way or the other, what's your body made of? Is it material stuff or immaterial stuff?
Right.
And either way, we can speak of substance dualism, I think.
Yes.
And oh yeah, and looks like Braxton's here.
Hey.
Hey, we love you, Braxton.
Hey, there's Braxton.
Yeah, and he was there at the same conference, and I said it was outside of Houston, and he reminded me it's Salado. I think Salado is how you say it.
Salado? Okay.
Yeah, one of the two. But
Okay.
yeah, thanks, Braxton. Good to see you, man. He's my boss.
Oh, okay.
I work at Trinity. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
He hasn't fired me yet, so it's good.
Good. Is it?
Oh, Salado.
Salado. Okay, that's good.
We got to start getting you at some of these conferences, man.
That'd be great.
Do you know Eric Hernandez?
Yes.
Yeah. I'd say, man, that guy is just a genius when it comes to talking about this. So I would love to have him and you on the same stage having a conversation on the soul together. He's been,
we should,
follows in the line of JP.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'd like to get, what's that?
So he's more of a Thomist.
No. I wouldn't say that. He's a substance dualist.
Good.
Molinist, free will guy. So now Braxton is asking this. Braxton just won't leave us alone. I was just watching a Hernandez debate and wondering if Farris knew him. So yeah, we got to get those two connected.
I do know of him.
Eric Hernandez.
Yeah.
But Eric puts on these big events called the Unapologetic Conference. I'll let him know that he needs to talk to you about being a speaker.
That'd be great.
So,
man,
I got so many more questions I'd like to ask you. We've gone so long. I'm just going to give it to you at this point. What have we not addressed that you feel is important to discuss before we sign off?
Well, I mean, there's a lot more obviously we could discuss and talk about. We could talk about several issues related to what we've been what we've been discussing. I didn't really give any distinct description of different views of substance dualism.
Oh yeah, right.
That's
right.
okay. I mean, well, I gave the right view, so it's fine. Joking.
That's all that matters.
I mean, there are other legitimate views on offer that do a lot of good work for a variety of reasons that we could obviously talk about. There's other things that we could say about obviously discussing more explicitly the origin of the soul. There's other things that we could say about the implications this has for the Imago Dei. There's other questions we could ask about in terms of the science and philosophy relationship, or even less talked about the science and theology relationship, the implications of the mind body has for that, which there are lots of implications. I mean, I think Certainly those issues are becoming hot button issues these days, and are hot button for Christians to think about
Yeah, that's right.
as we think about a whole host of new issues that we're just confronted with in the wider culture. The transhumanism or posthumanism, that whole set of literature that's related to anthropology, and then more broadly, sort of the theological implications. So that's 6 issues we need to talk about next time.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Yeah. Would you be willing to come back and have another conversation?
Sure.
Good.
Let's do
We
it.
need to make that happen.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I could just talk to you forever. Really, you're, like I said earlier, what you're doing is heavily related to the kinds of things that I'm focused on, but I'm not laser focusing on the kinds of things that you're focused on. But there's a lot of important overlap.
Sure.
Here, so I can just learn so much from you, and I'd love to continue to pick not pick your brain, but to pick your immaterial thinking thing.
That's right.
Yes, man, I'm glad you're going to be at EPS. Let's make sure to spend some time together there, and we'll keep hashing some of this out, and then I'll bring you back here on the YouTube channel. But
that'd be great.
Everybody watching, get this book, The Creation of Self: A Case for the Soul. Fantastic book. And man, even if you don't think that you have a soul or that you are a soul, get it anyway. Read it. Be open-minded. Be a good soul, and be open-souled. Right.
That's right.
Yeah, give it a shot and wrestle with it. If you think that Joshua Farris is dead wrong, well, read it and see what holes you can poke in it, and then send it back to us, and I'll ask them to interact with those questions. But
yes,
man, Joshua, thank you so much for being here.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Any parting words? Where can people find more of your stuff? What should they do?
Parting words. Yeah, I mean, you can find me at joshuarfarris.com, joshuarfarris.com. I need to say it 3 times, I've been told, joshuarfarris.com. And yeah, my YouTube channel. I mean, I'm not doing much privately or anything yet. Hopefully later. Not like you. You've got a lot of material on YouTube, but you can find me there, joshuarfarris.com. And my academia page for more academic publications if you want, for whatever reason. And then Amazon, of course, I have several more academic books. This one is the attempt to move in the more broad intellectual discussions. But
this is readable.
What's that?
This was very readable.
Oh, thank you.
I think most people are going to be able to, especially anybody who takes their theology and philosophy even slightly seriously, I think will be able to start at the beginning and work their way through this book. You did a great job writing it, making it accessible.
Thank you. So, yeah, that was the hope. At least some parts are more technical, but that's the hope. Yeah. That book is written for the one who disagrees, somebody who's not a theist, but also for a theist, because these would only be my parting words. I mean, the direction of the book heads in toward the end that points us not only to a full, sort of robust kind of view of God as the creator of the world and everything in it, but it points us in a direction that we really do need. And this is something that, I hang out with a lot of philosophers who are strict metaphysicians or really abstract metaphysical theologians, you might say. And I love that stuff.
Right.
But some of them are so more inclined to pure natural theology. But this book, I think toward the end, I think you'll notice if you read it carefully, I don't get into a lot of revelation. I don't get into the Bible in this book, but it does point us there.
Oh, yeah.
That there's something that we really need to understand about the nature of what it means to be human that requires divine revelation, specific, particular revelation that God has revealed to us in his word. And I mean, as a Christian, I would say the Bible, at least the Protestant canon, right? And we need that.
Yeah, so you're not just doing metaphysics and philosophy. This is kind of a bridge into apologetics,
Yeah,
right?
I would
Yeah.
say certainly. Yeah, I am certainly interested in that. Is bridge and apologetics, but this book is most of the book is a piece of, you might call it, natural theology
Mm-hmm.
or philosophy, but
Yeah.
it really does lead us to a point where we need to start looking to God for other answers
Yeah.
in His other revelation,
Amen.
in order to really understand the human being and what it means to be a human being. We
Yeah.
have to look to divine revelation for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, amen to that. Well, keep up the great work, and let's make sure to talk to each other here in a few weeks when we're in Texas together.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Man, I had a great time, and I just want to
Enjoyed
thank
it.
you for spending time with us today, Joshua, and to our viewers. Thank you for spending time with us today, and we hope you found this discussion enlightening. So, until next time, stay tuned and stay reasonable. See you soon.